Today is January 20th, 2021. Today is Inauguration Day. In just a couple hours from now, Joe Biden will be inaugurated as the 46th President of the United States, and Kamala Harris will be inaugurated as the 49th Vice President of the United States. I'm recording this on the morning of January 20th, 2021, Inauguration Day 2021, which means that Donald Trump only has a couple hours more of being president at this point. Donald Trump officially stops being president at 12 p.m. Eastern Time today, and right now it's 10:24 p.m. 10:24 a.m. Eastern Time, which means that he actually only has around an hour and a half left of being president. So I'm making this video because I started talking about Trump's presidency in yesterday's video, but I had so much to talk about that I couldn't fit it all in yesterday's video, so I decided to make another video over the topic, and I decided to make it before Donald Trump stops being president, because I think it'll fit better that way, but because because Joe Biden's inauguration is at noon Eastern Time, I don't have that much time left to make this video, so let's get into it right now. Donald Trump is about to not be president anymore. This is the end of an era. 1.5 hours left. After the past 4 years, it's felt like a really long time. It's been a long ride, but let's continue talking about what we were talking about yesterday. So, yesterday, I went into a lot of detail of Trump's, essentially his origin story, what originally got him to run, or what he was like during the primary season and the election cycle in 2016. So I talked about in 2011 how he accused Barack Obama of not being born in the United States. Then I talked about how he completely came out of nowhere and ran for president in 2015, and how nobody expected him to win, but he eventually ended up winning the presidential election in 2016 against Hillary Clinton. One thing I think I forgot to talk about in yesterday's video was that Donald Trump actually ran for president in the past before. Years before he ever ran for president on the Republican Party, he actually ran for president briefly back in 2000 under the Reform Party, which was a third party. It was a relatively new party started by Ross Perot. He was one of the several candidates. He was one of many candidates trying to become the nominee for the Reform Party back in 2000 for the 2000 election. That was the election with George Bush versus Al Gore. But Donald Trump did not win the nomination. That ended up going to Pat Buchanan. So Donald Trump actually has run for president before in the past, but I think most people forgot about that because most people were completely surprised when Donald Trump entered the race for president of the United States, but he actually did run back in 2000, which is at this point 21 years ago. But let's talk about Trump's actual presidency now. So in yesterday's video, I talked quite a bit about the first couple of years of Trump's presidency. I talked about 2017, how he fired the FBI director, and how he reacted to the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. In 2018, one pretty major event that happened under his presidency was the Parkland shooting in Florida. This was a school shooting that unfortunately took the lives of many children, and after that, a lot of young people were demanding stricter gun control regulations to try to prevent an event like that from taking place in the future. So that was a very tragic event. All these high school students lost their lives, and even the ones that did not lose their life, for them, it probably seriously traumatized them. So that is just an event I wish never happened, but that did unfortunately happen in early 2018. Throughout the rest of 2018, there really weren't that many major events. Yeah, Trump always found a way to get himself involved in a new scandal, but that is just normal at this point. Trump being talked about on the news for something new he did that was considered controversial, that is nothing new, but one thing that did happen in 2018 was the midterm elections. So these were the House elections where every member of the House was up for re-election. The Senate elections where a third of the members in the Senate were up for re-election. And there were also a lot of local elections, like elections for the governor of a state. There were two pretty notable elections in this election cycle back in the 2018 midterm elections. One of them was a Senate race, the other one was a gubernatorial race. One of them was in Texas, and the other one was in Georgia. Now, the reason why these two races were talked about by a lot of people was because these were two states that traditionally leaned towards the Republicans, traditionally leaned more conservative, but they were states where the Democratic nominee in both of these races, seemed like they had a really good shot of winning the. I guess in the case of Texas, it was the Senate race. In the case of Georgia, it was the gubernatorial race. In 2018, in Texas, there was a Senate race between Democratic nominee Beto O'Rourke, the Democratic challenger, and Republican nominee Ted Cruz, who was the incumbent. And this was one of the popular races at the time, one of the popular Senate races, because you had Texas, which was historically considered a Republican state, historically considered a conservative state that leaned towards the right, but you had this Democratic challenger who was serving in the House for a few years, but besides that, wasn't really that well known, and he was doing really well against Ted Cruz in the polls, and it seemed like he actually had a decent chance of winning, but he did not win that Senate race. He came up short by a couple percentage points, so Ted Cruz was able to remain the senator of Texas. Similarly, in Georgia, there was a gubernatorial race between the Republican nominee Brian Kemp and the Democratic challenger Stacey Abrams. And in this race, the Democratic challenger came even closer to beating the Republican. Georgia is a state that has historically voted for Republicans, historically leaned more towards the conservative side, but you had this Democratic challenger who came out of nowhere and was getting a lot of new people to turn out for her, and this was Stacey Abrams. Stacey Abrams was the Democratic nominee of this race, of the gubernatorial race in Georgia, and Brian Kemp was the Republican incumbent. Even though Stacey Abrams ran a notably good campaign, she did come up short by a tiny margin. She was so close to winning, but she came up short. But regardless, this was the first sign of what was to come in 2020 and 2021 for that matter for the state of Georgia because, as you probably know now, Biden won Georgia in the 2020 presidential election. Both Democrats won their Senate races in the 2021 runoff elections for the United States Senate. So I think that was essentially foreshadowing what would take place in 2020 and 2021 regarding Georgia, which I think is pretty interesting. So the midterm elections aren't really directly related to Trump because they're the midterm elections, not the presidential election. But I think that Donald Trump being president had an impact on the midterm elections. Overall, the midterm elections went better for the Democrats than they did for the Republicans. And one of the reasons why a lot of people think that's the case is because it was 2 years after Donald Trump, a Republican president, first got inaugurated, first got elected. So that is why some people think the midterm elections lean towards the Democrats, but there's many different reasons why that could have been, so I'm not sure what all the reasons are. That's the other major event that took place in 2018. Keep in mind though, throughout most of 2017 and essentially all of 2018, I did not pay much attention to politics. I did not pay much attention to news, so I probably don't remember that much of what actually happened at the time regarding President Trump or just regarding the United States as a whole. I was just a kid who was starting high school at the time, finishing up middle school, and I paid attention, like I said in yesterday's video, I paid attention quite a bit to the 2016 election cycle, but after that, once Trump actually became president, I mostly tuned out, mostly stopped paying attention to the news. But in 2019, that all changed with the Democratic primaries. The other thing is that the events that took place in the United States under President Trump from 2017 through 2019 pale in comparison to what happened in 2020 under President Trump. 2017 through 2019 has nothing on 2020 in terms of the amount of chaos that went down. And you probably know this, 2020 just finished up a few weeks ago. Even then, though, the chaos hasn't really finished up yet. We just had the Capitol riots or just 2 weeks ago at this point, January 6th, that was 2 weeks ago. I want to talk about this at the end of the video, though, so getting back to 2019, that is when two major things happened. There were many other things that took place in 2019, obviously. Some of them were also pretty important, but the two events that I think that were the most important, these were the Trump impeachment trials and the 2020 Democratic primaries kicking off. See, 2020 is an election year since it's a multiple of four. There's an election every 4 years. And the year before that is 2019, and that's why the Democratic primaries for the 2020 election cycle kicked off in 2019. So you had so many candidates declaring their candidacy for the 2020 Democratic primaries in 2019. There were over 20 candidates. There were so many candidates that they couldn't even fit every single candidate into even 2 debate nights. Even when they had 10 candidates per night, they couldn't fit every single candidate into 2 nights because there were more than 20 candidates. That just shows how many candidates there were. I believe that there were more candidates in this primary season than any other primary season in history, because I guess the primaries haven't really been around for that long. In that before like the 1970s, the United States citizens didn't really get to vote on who their nominee was. That was decided by the party themselves. But regardless, there were a lot of candidates, but a lot of them didn't really get that far. Most of the candidates never got above 1 to 2% of the polls, and even at that, the candidates that didn't always get above 5%. So you only had a few candidates that had a decent shot at winning the nomination. They were Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and Pete Buttigieg. And later on, Michael Bloomberg. But Michael Bloomberg filed his candidacy pretty late. He filed it in late November after several debates had already finished up. But because he bought so many ads, he was able to have a decent shot at winning for a while until Joe Biden made his comeback and beat Bernie Sanders on in South Carolina and on Super Tuesday. So I think one of the most important themes that came up during the 2020 Democratic primaries was electability. Who is more electable? Who is more capable of beating Donald Trump? Because among Democrats, Donald Trump is a president that's almost universally hated. Among Republicans, though, that's a completely different story. Republicans absolutely love the guy, at least up until 2 weeks ago they did, at least up until recent events, but that's besides the point. That's why I think Joe Biden ended up winning the nomination for the Democratic primaries, because he was perceived as one of the most electable candidates among Democrats. He was perceived as one of the candidates that had the best chance of winning the 2020 presidential election against Donald Trump. Bernie Sanders was doing well in the primaries for a while, but overall there were more moderate voters than there were progressive voters, and that's why I think Joe Biden won. A lot of people were afraid of nominating a progressive candidate. They wanted a more moderate candidate because they wanted a safer election, and their primary goal was to beat Donald Trump. The other thing that happened in 2019 was, like I said, the impeachment trials. I'm not going to go into the details right now, but essentially Donald Trump got impeached by the House, but he did not get convicted by the Senate. So in late 2019 the House voted to impeach him, but in early 2020 the Senate voted to acquit him. And then right after this is when COVID-19 happened. COVID-19, I think, is what ruined Donald Trump's chances at a second term, because in the first 3 years of his presidency, Donald Trump wasn't at that low of an approval rating. I think he would have easily won a second term if the election was held a year earlier, on like November of 2019, because at the time he was having a pretty decent economy. But in general, the events that take place in the fourth year of a presidential term matter much more for an election than the first 3 years, and that's why Donald Trump lost the 2020 presidential election. Nobody liked the way he handled COVID throughout 2020 and the other events that took place throughout the last year. So what I find ironic actually is the fact that exactly a year ago, today's inauguration day, right? Exactly a year ago on January 20th, 2020, that's when the very first COVID case popped up in the United States. That day, I remember I was thinking to myself, 1 more year or 5 more years of Donald Trump? And I was thinking, it's probably 5 more years. Donald Trump has a good chance of winning this election, but that is the very day that COVID-19, the thing that ruined his chances at a second term, popped up in the United States. Now it's worse than ever. Now we have over 400,000 deaths, so that is a very unfortunate tragedy. The fact that it got this bad, that's just something that's just depressing to think about, but that's why Donald Trump lost. A lot of people didn't approve the way he handled the COVID-19 crisis. A lot of people also didn't approve the way he handled the BLM protest this past summer, the protest in response to the killing of George Floyd. And then the debates, I don't think his debate performances were nearly as good this time around, as they were 4 years ago in 2016. That's another reason why he might have lost. Then he got COVID-19 at the last second. 2020 election came around. It took many days to finish up because of mail-in ballots. Because of the pandemic, a lot of people voted by mail. At first, Donald Trump was up, and a lot of people were thinking that Donald Trump was going to win a second term, but that was before a lot of the mail-in ballots were counted. So on November 3rd, Trump was up, but on November 4th, 5th, 6th, Joe Biden kept on getting more and more of those mail-in ballots. And then on November 7th, Joe Biden was officially declared the winner of the 2020 presidential election. Then for 2 months straight after that, Donald Trump kept denying the results of the election. He kept denying that he was the loser and that Joe Biden won because he claimed that there was voter fraud, but then after he filed lawsuits, there was no evidence of voter fraud. And then that's eventually what led to the January 6th riots, the fact that a lot of people thought that Trump deserved to win even though he didn't because there was no voter fraud. But a lot of people didn't think that. And then Trump got impeached again, and that's where we are today now. Now Biden's gonna get inaugurated.